Hey, what's going on? So today I'm going to continue where I left off with the engine bay. Mainly going to try and start doing some work with the Fender Aprons, kind of decide on what I want to do with those. These are actually pre-bought, prefab panels that you can buy online. It's a company called Scott Rod Fabrications, and they make these Fender Apron panels. They make a whole bunch of other sheet metal parts for pretty much any Mustang. I know Fox Body's an up for sure, but yeah, these are real nice. They just take the the guesswork and pretty much eliminate all the hours of work that it would take to make these yourself. And I'm telling you right now, I would never be precise enough to make something like this on my own, but yeah, they fit really well out of the box. There is some trimming required. Some people have to take up to like a 1/4 inch off the edge here. Mine fit pretty good. I think I'm gonna have to shave it down just a tad on the edges, but for the most part they fit really well. It's just sheet metal, pre-bent, pre-stamped, and then they're just tacked into place. And then you can kind of do whatever you want to do with them, or install them how you see fit, really. These pieces I also bought from the same company. These are the frame rail sills, and they just kind of, like you saw in the previous video, they just kind of go over your existing frame rails. They're precision cut, super nice, super clean. It's got a little lip that kind of runs along the bottom of the frame rail, and then all the tabs and brackets, you don't have to do anything with them. You just kind of put it over on top. So super nice pieces. And again, these weren't very expensive at all. I think the whole setup was like about 200 or maybe just under 200 bucks US. So really not that bad considering the time it would take you, the time, materials and stuff like that it would take you to do something like this. And they're not much more than what you'd pay for a stock Fender Apron replacement or any of those aftermarket ones. So for me it was like a win-win. Have to replace the killed Fender Aprons on my car, and at the same time it'll look 10 times nicer. So if you're at this stage, like car's completely torn apart, and you want to kind of make things a little nicer, then this is definitely something you should consider for sure. So from what I've seen, there's about 3 different ways that people install these new panels. The first way is they leave all the stock factory sheet metal. They don't do much cutting at all, and they try to fit the new panels in with the factory sheet metal. And for this side in particular, it all fits in fairly nice. The downside of that, if it's a downside at all, is you kind of see the new panel behind the old sheet metal. So in my opinion, that's really not a big deal at all. I mean, these factory holes are here whether you have this panel or not, so to have something behind them, not a big deal, especially if you paint it all the same color. That would be the first way, keep all the factory metal. Second way is people like to cut these Fender Aprons out. So what they'll do is, the cleanest way to do it would be to remove the factory spot welds. And I mentioned this lip briefly in my previous video, but this like rail piece has a little lip that is spot welded to the Fender Aprons. So what they do is they drill out all these spot welds all along the seam of the Fender Apron, and what that will do is it'll remove the apron from the metal. You still need a cutoff disc, I think, to cut off the top, because the Fender Apron piece actually rolls over to the top. So you pretty much remove all the spot welds, and I think you make one cut here and then one cut down here, and then you can pop the whole thing out. So that would be probably the cleanest and the nicest way to do it. And then the third way is you forget about the spot welds. You just take your cutoff disc, angle grinder, and just cut along the seam, and then grind it down, clean it up. It'll look just as good. I'd probably favor leaving the metal in because it doesn't harm anything, and honestly it doesn't look any worse than it did before. Yeah, you have this piece of metal kind of poking through, but really, is it a big deal? Especially if it's covered up and painted the same color, it really wouldn't look too bad. The passenger side, as I'm going to show you right now, it's not perfect. So that kind of takes that option off the table for me. I'm going to end up cutting out the other side, so I'm going to have to cut out this side as well to match it up. So as you can see, I got this nice, clean and carefully cut hole right here that has absolutely no finesse to it whatsoever. So it pretty much made up my choice for me, and that's basically to just go ahead and cut everything out. Like I said before, I'd be okay with leaving the factory sheet metal in there, but since the one side's kind of messed up, I can't just leave one side and cut out the other, so just gonna cut everything out. But that's not a big deal, no big deal at all. Once it's all cut out, it'll all be a distant memory.
So here's the driver's side Fender Apron. The stock one's obviously all cut out. Basically, like I showed earlier, what I did was I drilled out all the spot welds on the bottom and the far side here, and that basically released the panel from the sheet metal here. And then after I did that, what I had to do was basically cut out the top, and that was relatively easy. All I did was just follow the nice clean factory seam here. And then what you have to do is figure out how you want to cut the side of the apron here. I wouldn't recommend completely cutting it out just because it's spot welded to the front of the chassis, and then this like top rail is spot welded to the sheet metal as well. So best bet would probably be to leave it in, but it's up to you on how you cut it. I basically left a 2-inch, kind of like a 2-inch gap, just so I could tuck in the new piece nicely and still have it, you know, looking real clean. So this is the passenger side. If you remember, this was the side that was kind of cut up all sloppy. What I ended up doing is very simple. I basically just smoothed out the cut that was made there, and then kind of gave it an angle to transition it down into the seam that is there from the factory. And I think it looks good. I think it looks good enough. I just wanted something that was nice and clean. If I ever took the fender off and had to do any work, at least it would be, you know, at least it would be somewhat presentable. So that just made the most sense to me. So I didn't end up filming too much of it just because I kind of got into a groove, and it's nothing you really haven't seen before. If anything, it's just a big dusty mess. But I ended up continuing on with stripping the old paint, mainly the areas that I'm gonna be working on. Here you can kind of see I drew a line where the new Fender Aprons are gonna sit. Did a couple of other things too. I ended up filling the holes in the strut tower for a cleaner look. Might as well, right? And I gotta do the other side still, but I'll do that later on. I ended up deciding on 2K epoxy primer, so I'm going to scuff it up for better adhesion, and then I'll top coat it. Once the new panels go in, there's no access to any of these panels anymore, so definitely want to protect them from any, you know, rust or corrosion down the road. I think it'll do the job. So another thing I did was I ended up tracing out the frame rail sill covers onto a piece of paper. I cut them out and I laid them back onto the frame rails on the car, just so I could match up all the factory holes. And then basically you match up all the factory holes, you trace them out, and you mark them. So now I have these like stencils in case I want to know where all the factory holes are in the future, because once you put the frame rail sills on, you're not really going to see or know where the holes are. And instead of drilling out new holes, I'll know where the factory holes are. And that's important just for, you know, brake lines and power steering and all that stuff, because I can just match up my stencils, and if I want to run the brake lines like it was from factory, I'll know exactly where the factory holes are, so I can put the appropriate brackets back into place without drilling unnecessary holes that don't need to be in the frame rails. So I started to scuff up the new Fender Aprons. Before they go in, I'm going to put a couple of coats of epoxy primer on these guys as well, just to protect the back sides of them. Once they're welded in, it's going to be really tough to get in certain spots, so I figured now would be the time. You obviously can't weld on top of epoxy primer, so I'm going to leave the edge all the way around, and I'm going to put a coat of weld-through primer on the edges, just so the whole panel, the whole back side of the panel will be covered in some sort of primer. So the majority of it will be covered in epoxy, and then wherever I'm welding, the edges will be covered in a weld-through primer. So a little bit of a pain in the ass, and it's definitely time consuming, but it's these little things that you have to do to ensure that all the work that you've put in, you know, will go a long way, and it's something that you're not going to have to go back and revisit and redo. So, you know, it might be a little annoying, but it definitely has to be done. Alright, cool. So everything's painted up. I got everything covered in epoxy, and what I did was I masked off the bottom, and I put a final top coat just to protect the underside of the new aprons, just because you're not going to be able to get to these as easy. Once they're on the car, you're going to be up against the frame rails, so they're not going to be very accessible. But yeah, they're all painted up, they're looking really good, other than a little bit of overspray, but it really doesn't matter. They're going to be scuffed down and recoated. It's just basically to get a coating on there, so once they're in, any section that would be hard to get to is, you know, is well protected. So I also got the back side of the frame rail sills all covered in epoxy primer, and then a top coat. And then yeah, and then I got all the frame rails, inner fenders, all covered up. Same process. It's
2-part epoxy primer, and then I put a nice couple layers of top coat on it, so that should be more than enough. So the K-member and whole front suspension are out of the car. So much more space to move around. Probably should have done it sooner, but getting it up by myself was quite a challenge. A little awkward to move around, but it's out. So I've got the passenger side tacked into place, ran a couple of tacks along the top and down the side, ran a couple of plug welds along the bottom rail, welded it at the bottom as well just to make sure this thing doesn't move. So a couple of plug welds at the top in the harder to get areas. I'll be going back and doing a little bit more welding in the corner there. So it's time to go back, fully stitch weld the top and side seams, grind it down a little bit, and start fitting in the frame rail sills. Alright, so passenger side is in. We got the top all welded up, got the side and the bottom, all the gaps are filled. Looks so much better. So kind of marked out some holes. I'm going to do some plug welds and weld this into the frame rail.